The night was cloaked in an unsettling silence, broken only by the clinking of ice in Lucas Weber's whiskey glass. He stared out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, each twinkling light outside feeling like a mocking reminder of his humiliation. The betrayal was still fresh. Scarlett, his fiancée of nearly 3 years, had traded their promises of forever for a relationship with his biggest business rival, Benjamin Gray. And she hadn't just betrayed him, she had made a spectacle of it, turning him into the punchline of high society gossip. Known for his cold and calculated demeanor, Lucas felt something new that night, an overwhelming desire for revenge. Proving he had moved on in a grand and undeniable way would be his weapon against her. He needed a plan. The next morning, as he walked through the gardens of his estate, his gaze fell on Grace. She was kneeling on the ground, carefully tending to a rosebush. The young gardener was simple, with her hair tied back in a ponytail and wearing modest clothes that stood in stark contrast to the elegance surrounding her. When she noticed his presence, she quickly stood, wiping her hands on her work pants. "Good morning, Mr. Weber. Do you need something?" she asked, her voice polite yet firm. Lucas studied her for a moment. There was something about Grace, her authenticity perhaps, that was the complete opposite of everything Scarlett embodied. An idea began to form. "You live nearby, don't you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir. I live with my mother." "How is she? I heard she's been unwell." The question caught her off guard. He had never shown any interest in her personal life before. "She's not doing well, but we're managing," she replied cautiously. Lucas nodded as though weighing his next words. "We need to talk. Come to my office tonight." Grace spent the day feeling a mixture of anxiety and confusion. When the clock struck 8, she made her way to the main mansion. Lucas was waiting, seated in a leather armchair with his usual serious expression. "Grace, I'll get straight to the point. I have a proposal for you." She shifted uneasily in her chair, unsure of what to expect. "A marriage," he said bluntly. Her eyes widened in shock. "Excuse me. A marriage of convenience. You'll marry me for 1 year. In return, I'll pay for your mother's treatment in full and provide you with a generous sum to help you start over." Grace felt a wave of shock and indignation, but before she could reject the idea, he continued, "I'm not asking you to like me or pretend to have feelings for me. This is strictly business. My goal is simple, to show the world I've moved on in a way that humiliates Scarlett and silences anyone who thinks I've been defeated." She stood up, her voice tinged with outrage. "You think you can buy everything, don't you? I'm offering you something that can save your mother, Grace. Think carefully." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her mother needed urgent treatment, and she knew she couldn't afford it on her own. After a long, tense silence, she finally responded, "I'll do it, but on one condition: respect. I'll play along with your game, but I won't tolerate being treated as less." Lucas met her gaze, impressed by her courage. "Deal, Grace. A respect is something I can promise." Grace didn't know what was harder, learning to walk in high heels or enduring the critical gaze of Lily, the image consultant hired by Lucas. From the moment she signed the marriage contract, her life had turned upside down. "Posture, Grace. You're not in a garden anymore. You're in high society," Lily exclaimed, tapping the wooden ruler she used to correct her stance. Grace took a deep breath and tried once again to walk across the room with her head held high and her shoulders back. This transformation was part of the deal. Lucas had insisted she present herself as someone capable of facing the sharp eyes of São Paulo's elite. Still, beneath the rigorous training, Grace remained true to herself. The first time Lily suggested she change her natural brown hair, Grace flatly refused. "If you expect me to become something completely fake, I won't be able to keep up this act," she had told Lucas. He had only smirked, surprised by her firmness. The transformation culminated in a gala night, the first major event the couple was to attend together. Grace looked stunning in a simple yet elegant navy blue gown that highlighted her natural beauty. Beside her, Lucas wore his usual impeccable suit, his expression closed but confident. As they entered the ballroom, all eyes turned to them. Whispers rippled through the room, and the comments began immediately. Who is she? Where did this woman come from? But no gaze was as cutting as Scarlett's. Dressed in a sparkling red gown, she strode over to Lucas with a venomous smile. "What a surprise to see you here, Lucas. And you brought company?" Before he could respond, Grace extended her hand. "Pleasure, Grace Weber, his wife." Scarlett blinked, momentarily thrown off by Grace's confident demeanor, but it didn't take long for her to recover her poise. "Wife?" That was quick. "Well, I wish you luck. You'll need it," she said, before walking away. Lucas glanced at Grace with something close to admiration. She wasn't just a pawn in his game, she was beginning to show she had strength of her own. The relationship between Lucas and Grace felt like a minefield. Most of the time he remained distant, cold like a strategist who still believed he was fully in control. Grace, however, wasn't someone to bow down to arrogance or disdain. The morning after the gala, as Lucas reviewed contracts in his mansion's office, Grace suddenly walked in, her eyes blazing with indignation. "You think you can throw me into a room full of hostile people without warning me?" she snapped. Lucas looked up, surprised by the interruption. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially in his own house. "I thought you were prepared. It wasn't supposed to be that hard," he replied dryly. "Prepared? That place was a circus and I was the main attraction. And you just stood there watching like it had nothing to do with you." The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, Lucas realized Grace wasn't just a passive participant in the plan. She was demanding more from him. "If this is a marriage of convenience, then we both have roles to play, and yours, Lucas, includes supporting me. Got it?" Grace concluded, turning to leave before he could respond. Those words stayed with Lucas for days. He began watching Grace more closely, noticing the strength she showed when facing the stares and whispers of staff and guests. One defining moment occurred when Grace was in the garden, arranging flowers for an event at the mansion. Scarlett showed up unexpectedly, accompanied by Benjamin Gray. "What a surprise to see you working, Grace. I thought as Lucas's wife, you'd have an army of servants doing this for you," Scarlett said with a sly smile. Grace looked up from the basket of flowers and replied calmly, "I prefer doing things my way. Seems like that bothers some people." Scarlett opened her mouth to retort, but before she could continue, Lucas appeared, walking over with a serious expression. "Scarlett, you weren't invited to this conversation. If you have something to say, address it to me." Scarlett stepped back, surprised by Lucas's firmness. For the first time, he seemed to be defending Grace, and not just as part of a plan. After Scarlett left, Lucas turned to Grace. "You were right that morning. It's not fair for you to face this alone." Grace looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For the first time, there was something genuine between them, however faint. The weeks that followed were marked by more frequent interactions between Lucas and Grace. While they remained distant in many ways, moments of vulnerability began to emerge. Small gestures, like the way Lucas waited for Grace to finish her tea before starting a conversation, or how she left little notes in his planner with gentle reminders, created an unexpected dynamic. But it was on a quiet morning, while Grace was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, that her routine was turned upside down. A sudden wave of nausea made her drop the glass she was holding. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the kitchen, and a maid rushed over to help her. "Are you all right, Mrs. Grace?" the maid asked, concerned. Grace nodded, trying to mask her discomfort, but she knew something was wrong. 2 days later, at the insistence of a friend, Grace decided to visit the doctor. Sitting in the waiting room, her heart raced. She knew it was a possibility, but the confirmation still came as a shock. Pregnant. The drive back to the mansion was a whirlwind of thoughts. How would Lucas react? He had always been clear that their marriage was just a contract, and Grace feared the pregnancy might complicate things further. That evening, during dinner, she finally found the courage to speak. "Lucas, we need to talk." He looked up from his plate, noting the seriousness in her tone. "What's going on?" Grace took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed felt endless. Lucas remained still, processing the information. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice softer than Grace expected. "Yes." The doctor confirmed it. To her surprise, Lucas didn't react with coldness. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, and looked at her with an expression that mixed concern and something close to acceptance. "This changes everything," he said, more to himself than to her. In the days that followed, Lucas seemed more present. He insisted on accompanying Grace to a doctor's appointment and started asking questions about the baby, something Grace never imagined he would do. For the first time, she saw a side of Lucas that wasn't driven by control or revenge, but by a genuine attempt to connect. Scarlett, however, quickly noticed the change. At a public event, she approached Grace with a venomous smile. "So you did it, didn't you? Pregnancy is always a good way to secure your spot." Before Grace could respond, Lucas appeared at her side. "If you have anything to say about my wife or my child, Scarlett, I suggest you keep it to yourself." Scarlett stepped back, clearly shaken by Lucas's firmness. He wasn't just defending Grace, he was showing that for the first time he was truly committed. Grace was finally starting to feel more comfortable in her new life. Despite the challenges, small moments of connection with Lucas were creating an unexpected bond between them. He was more attentive, accompanied her to medical appointments, and seemed genuinely interested in the baby's future. But the calm didn't last long. That afternoon, while Grace was watering the plants in the garden, something she did to stay grounded in her true self, a shout echoed from the mansion. It was Lily, the image consultant. "Grace, have you seen this?" she exclaimed, holding a tablet out to Grace. When Grace took the device, she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The headline read, "Marriage contract between millionaire Lucas Weber and humble gardener leaked to scandal unfolds." The article detailed parts of the agreement, including the amount Lucas had offered to pay for Grace's mother's medical treatment and the stipend for the duration of their marriage. Humiliation washed over her. Before she could react, Lucas appeared, his face grim and tense. "Grace, we need to talk." She followed him into the office. As soon as the door closed, she lashed out. "How did this happen? You promised this would stay secret." "I don't know how it leaked, but I'll find out. I'm already getting my legal team on it to contain the damage." "Contain the damage, Lucas. This isn't about you or your company. This is about me. About my life being exposed and humiliated publicly." Lucas stood silent, watching her fury. Grace felt tears welling up, but refused to cry in front of him. "I agreed to this for my mother, but now I'm just some gold digger in everyone's eyes, aren't I?" she said, her voice trembling. "Grace, I never saw you that way," he replied softly. "That doesn't matter. You put me in this position, Lucas, and I can't do it anymore." Grace left the office without looking back. That night, she packed her things and left the mansion. Lucas spent the night pacing in his room. For the first time, he realized his plan hadn't just failed. It had hurt someone he was beginning to care about. Grace's absence turned Lucas's mansion into a cold, empty place. He found himself thinking about her determination, the fire in her eyes when she stood up to him, and the way she brought life to everything around her. For the first time, Lucas realized that the contract had never been the center of their relationship. He wanted Grace, not as part of a plan, but as someone genuine and essential in his life. Determined to make things right, Lucas decided to do something he'd never done before: open up publicly and admit his mistakes. He planned a special event in the mansion's gardens, the place he knew was Grace's sanctuary. On the afternoon of the event, Grace arrived hesitantly. She had received a formal invitation but didn't know what to expect. As she entered the garden, she was surprised to see the space transformed. The flowers she had planted were prominently displayed, surrounded by tiny lights that created a magical atmosphere. Lucas stood in the center, devoid of his usual coldness. His suit was as impeccable as ever, but there was something new in his expression: vulnerability. "Grace, thank you for coming," he said, taking a step forward. "Why am I here, Lucas?" she asked, keeping a guarded stance. He took a deep breath before starting. "I'm here to apologize, not just for the contract being leaked, but for putting you in that position from the start. I was selfish. I thought I could use you as a pawn in my plan, but what I didn't expect was to find someone so extraordinary." Grace remained silent, her eyes scrutinizing every word. "I don't know how to do this right, but I want to try. I want to build something real with you." "Do you want this for me? Or are you just trying to fix your mistake?" she asked, challenging him. Lucas gave a small smile, recognizing the strength he had always admired in her. "Because I want you, not as part of a plan, but because I've realized I'm a better man with you by my side." Grace felt a lump in her throat. His sincerity was disarming, but she knew she couldn't forget everything overnight. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Lucas." "Then let me prove that you can." "I don't expect you to forgive me now, but I want the chance to earn your trust back one day at a time." For a long moment, Grace pondered. Then she gave a small nod. "It won't be easy." "I don't expect it to be," he replied, determination shining in his eyes. As they walked together through the garden, Grace realized that, for the first time, Lucas didn't seem like the calculating man she had met. He seemed human. Months had passed since Lucas and Grace's reconciliation. Although challenges remained, the two were working to rebuild trust and create something real. Lucas, once so controlling and closed off, now showed a more sensitive and present side, especially when it came to Grace and their unborn baby. The moment finally arrived on a rainy night. Grace felt the first contractions while she was in the library, reading one of the books Lucas had left for her. He rushed to take her to the hospital, holding her hand tightly the entire way, repeating, "I'm here, Grace, don't worry." Hours later, Grace's cries gave way to the sweetest sound they had ever heard, the cry of a baby. Henry was born healthy, with a full head of dark hair that made Lucas smile as he noticed the resemblance. Lucas held his son in his arms, his eyes glistening with emotion. He looked at Grace, still exhausted but glowing, and whispered, "Thank you." Grace gave a faint smile, too overcome with emotion to speak. Henry's arrival brought a new dynamic to their relationship. Lucas, who once avoided emotional matters, now embraced fatherhood with enthusiasm. He made it a point to be involved in every moment, from changing diapers to putting the baby to sleep. Grace also thrived in her new phase of life. Despite sleepless nights, she felt like she was finally finding her place in the world. With Lucas's support, she began planning to open her own landscaping business, something she had always dreamed of but never thought possible. Scarlett, however, hadn't disappeared entirely. In a final attempt to stir trouble, she spread rumors that Lucas was only with Grace because of the baby. But unlike before, Lucas didn't care. When a friend brought up the gossip, he simply replied, "My family knows the truth, and that's all that matters." In the mansion's garden, now filled with new flowers chosen by Grace, Lucas and Grace often spent time with Henry. One afternoon, as Lucas held the baby, he looked at Grace and said, "You've changed me, you know." "You're the one who chose to change, Lucas," she replied with a calm smile. "Maybe, but you were the reason." And there, surrounded by the garden that symbolized growth and hope, they began a new chapter as a family. The mansion's garden had become the heart of the house, a reflection of the transformation of Lucas and Grace. It was there they spent much of their time, playing with Henry, now a few months old, and making plans for the future. What had once symbolized a facade now stood as a place of genuine growth, much like their relationship. However, Scarlett wasn't ready to fade away without one last attempt at manipulation. During a charity event attended by Lucas and Grace, she appeared uninvited. Dressed to impress, with the same poisonous charm as always, she approached Lucas while Grace spoke with other guests. "Lucas, you know you can do better than this, don't you?" she whispered, referring to Grace. "You're only with her because she gave you a child." This time, Lucas didn't hesitate. He stepped back, physically distancing himself from Scarlett, and replied firmly, "Scarlett, I hope you find peace someday because I already have, and Grace is the reason for that." Scarlett tried to maintain her smile, but her eyes betrayed how deeply his words had struck. For the first time, Lucas wasn't just rejecting her. He was making it clear that she no longer had a place in his life. After the event, as they returned home, Grace looked at Lucas curiously. "I saw you talking to Scarlett." "She tried to provoke me, but I didn't let her," he said with a calm smile. "Nothing she says matters anymore." Grace felt a wave of relief. For the first time, she fully believed Lucas's words. The following months brought stability and happiness for the family. Grace launched her landscaping business, which quickly gained popularity. Lucas, in turn, began balancing his professional and family life, something that had once seemed impossible. On Henry's first birthday, they hosted a small celebration in the garden. As they watched friends and family interact, Lucas held Grace's hand. "I used to think I knew what success was, but now I really understand," he said. "And what does success mean to you now?" she asked, smiling. "This, you, Henry, our family, the garden we've built together." Grace rested her head on his shoulder, letting his words sink in. They weren't perfect, but they were learning, growing, and above all choosing love every single day. The garden, once a symbol of an empty contract, now represented the rebirth of two people who, together, had found something real.